The first generation of Core i series processors came about in 2008 with the release of the Bloomfield-based Core i7 CPUs. These weren't particularly mainstream, however, due to cost. Fast forward a couple of years though, and you got what we have here today, the Core i3 550, based on the Clarkdale architecture, which actually derives from the same Nehalem architecture that the Bloomfield i7s use. So just how does this now 10-year-old dual-core hyper-threaded CPU perform, you might ask? Well, stick around until after the intro to find out a little bit more about this mainstream Nehalem-based CPU before we jump into some benchmarks. As I mentioned before the intro, the Clarkdale-based i3 550 is actually based on the Nehalem architecture. Strictly speaking, it's actually the Westmere architecture, which has its origins in the Nehalem architecture, because what Intel did to get the Westmere architecture was they took the 45nm based Nehalem architecture, shrank it down to 32 nanometers, and then took the integrated memory controller from the CPU die of the Nehalem architecture, moved that over to the integrated graphics chip, and then connected the two of them with a QPI link. This has a negative effect on memory access latency for the CPU die though, but massively reduces latency for the integrated graphics should you actually choose to use that. Launching on the 30th of May 2010 at the price of $138 or $164 and 69 cents today, the dual-core hyper-threaded i3 550 ran at 3.2 GHz, which was achieved by a base clock of 133 MHz and a CPU multiplier of 24. The CPU die featured 386 million transistors, with the die containing integrated graphics and memory controller featuring 177 million. There was support for dual-channel DDR3 RAM, up to a speed of 1333 MHz, versus the Bloomfield i7's triple-channel capability. The 550 CPU die also has 64 KB of L1 cache per core, 256 KB of L2 cache per core, and 4 MB of L3 cache, which the i3 550 shares between both of its two cores. Another difference compared to the 550's high-end Bloomfield counterparts is that it uses socket 1156 motherboards, compared to socket 1366 that Bloomfield used. The rest of the system that we're going to be using to benchmark the i3 550 with today features a Gigabyte GA P45 USB 3 motherboard. We're also using 8GB of 1600 MHz DDR3 RAM, although the i3 550 only supports a maximum selectable speed of 1333 MHz, and well, our 550 at least, and a second 550 we also have, had extreme problems with running memory over that 1333 MHz, so even for the overclocks we're sticking to that 1333 MHz as well. But other than that, we're also using a MSI GTX 1080 Armoury C Edition graphics cards from my personal PC to eliminate any potential bottlenecks there. We're also running an operating system from an SSD, and all of the games are running from a mechanical hard drive. Cooling wise, we're also using a Phanteks TC14PE cooler for the CPU. So let's get on with the benchmarks. Kicking things off with Crysis at 1080p with the lowest settings in DirectX 10 mode, and at first, the i3 550 appears to perform quite well. There is what appears to be some minor frame time inconsistency when you look at the sand, but you can barely notice it. Once you get down onto the beach after using the binoculars for the first time during the opening mission though, you do start to notice a fair amount of micro-stuttering, which gets progressively worse as the mission goes on. It is actually bad enough at points that it made my eyes hurt, so in terms of playability, you will want to avoid Crysis if you value having eyes that aren't currently melting. Benchmark-wise, the 550 managed 98.1, 50.9 and 35.1 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. This is a good example of why 1% and 0.1% lows aren't always a good indicator of the stutter you may or may not see, as they are essentially an average of the lowest 1% and 0.1% of frames respectively, so on occasion they won't be representative of any outliers. The overclock does improve things a fair bit, but doesn't eliminate the micro stutter we saw. although after testing I realised that the overclock was potentially a bit unstable, which you can tell by the 0.1% lows being worse than they were at stock clocks. 2016's Doom actually runs relatively well on the Vulkan API, using the lowest settings at 1080p. The frame times were slightly inconsistent throughout, which you would notice as minor micro-stuttering. It is minor enough that you won't always notice it, although in the final part of the UEC mission, it does get reasonably noticeable, but not to the point that it makes gameplay jarring or any less enjoyable. It is a different story in OpenGL though, in which performance is awful. There is quite noticeable micro-stuttering throughout the entire mission, which only gets worse in the last part of the mission. There is even pretty awful stuttering in the menu upon opening the game, although that does stop after a few minutes. And I wouldn't get your hopes up for the overclock improving OpenGL performance, because the stuttering is still extremely noticeable, and the performance is still worse in Vulkan at stock clocks. That aside, the i3 550 manages 105.7, 53.4 and 37.4 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively at stock clocks in the Vulkan API. The overclock boosts these figures up a fair bit, up to 129.9, 70.1 and 49.3 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. There is still some slight micro stutter at points throughout, and it does still get a bit more noticeable in the last part of the mission. You will also still notice the frame time inconsistency when moving the camera around at speed, which was present at stock clocks too. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p with the lowest settings in DirectX 11 mode, as DX12 performs worse in our case, really doesn't run great at all on the 550, although to be fair it is the most CPU intensive game in the tests today. We're also using the game's built-in benchmark, so results may or may not vary compared to the actual gameplay. There is noticeable stuttering and minor hitches throughout the benchmark in all three scenes, although the frame time inconsistency is most noticeable in the final scene of the benchmark, as that is a wide panning shot of a mountain range which moves down into a small village with lots of intricate little details. At stock, the 550 managed 42.2, 23.4 and 18.8 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. The overclock improves things a little bit, but not by much, and the issues we saw with micro stutter and minor hitching are still present. Not as severe as at stock, mind you, but they're still there and still noticeable. Grand Theft Auto 5 is still one of the most played games today, and much favours CPUs with 4 actual physical cores, rather than dual cores with hyperthreading. At 1080p with the lowest settings in DirectX 11 mode, performance really isn't great at all. The frame times, like previous games, are very inconsistent throughout, and it is quite noticeable. It will get better in less intensive areas such as the highway between the city and the desert, but the vast majority of the game is spent in either the city or desert areas, so you're not going to get much of a break from the stutter. It is still playable, mind you, so if you're desperate to play GTA 5 and can't get anything better, you will still be able to play at least, but graphically it won't be the most enjoyable of experiences. The benchmark shows the 550 managing average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 48.9, 31.4 and 26.7 FPS respectively. Again, this shows that 0.1% lows aren't the best indicator of the sort of stutter you may or may not see, as actual performance was clearly worse than what the 1% and 0.1% lows showed. The overclock made a large and quite noticeable improvement over stock clocks, although performance still isn't great at all. There is still noticeable frame time inconsistency, with frame times varying by as much as around 13 to 20 milliseconds throughout, which you are going to notice. To finish off the games is CSGO at 1080p with the lowest settings. I've left texture streaming and boost player contrast set to enabled, and left Uber shaders on auto, which defaults to enabled. It is a fairly bloated game nowadays compared to what it used to be, so while performance on the i3 550 back on CSGO's release in 2012 may have been decent, I'm not sure if it actually was or not, it certainly isn't anymore. The game has a stuttery appearance throughout the Mirage map I'm using for testing, which only gets more noticeable upon turning the camera. The game is still playable despite this, but if you can get better, I certainly wouldn't want to play like this. Stock clocks managed 104.7, 47.9 and 24.4 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Performance improved quite noticeably with the overclock to 150.4, 69.2 and 37.7 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. There was still slight micro stuttering throughout, which again you notice a bit more when turning the camera, but it is far better than it was at stock. There are also a few moments throughout where you will notice some more noticeable stuttering, but only for very brief periods of time. So now that the gaming benchmarks are out of the way, we're moving on to the more non-gaming focused benchmarks. And for that, we're also going to be comparing the performance of the i3 550 at stock and overclocked with its performance with hyperthreading disabled and single-threaded performance as well. Just to give you an idea of the single-threaded performance of the i3 550 and the impact on performance that hyperthreading has, both disabled and enabled. Cinebench R23 is first up for the non-gaming benchmarks. This is a multi-threaded, tile-based rendering benchmark based on Maxon's Cinema 4D rendering engine. This isn't the most representative of benchmarks because the Cinema 4D engine isn't that widely used. Most people actually prefer to use Blender instead, which we also have a benchmark for after this. But we're including R23 anyway because I don't care and I want to. And at stock clocks, the i3 550 manages 1,302 points, compared to 955.33 points with hyperthreading turned off, or 502.33 points single thread performance, which is a 61.42% reduction from the dual-core i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled, or a 47.42% reduction from i3 550 with hyperthreading disabled. The 4.22 GHz overclock pushes the multi-core with hyperthreading score up to 1,756.67 points, 34.92% over stock clocks. And with hyperthreading off, the i3 550 is now effectively equalling the score it managed to set at stock clocks with hyperthreading enabled, with 1,311.33 points, although as you'll see soon, it does this while pulling significantly more power. Single thread performance sees a smaller increase over what it managed at stock clocks, but an increase nonetheless of 28% to 643 points. Next up is Blender, which is a lot more widely used than the Cinema 4D engine that Cinebench R23 is based on. And for this we're using the Fishy cutscene, which is freely available to download online. We run this benchmark 3 times and take an average in seconds of time to render a single frame. And at stock clocks, the i3 550 manages to render the frame in 165.8 seconds. Hyperthreading off, this goes up by 16.77% to 193.6 seconds. This time to render then goes up by a further 54.36% over the non-hyperthreaded score, up to 298.85 seconds, which is nearly 5 minutes. This is an increase in time to render of 80.25% over the multi-core hyperthreaded score. For the multi-core hyperthreaded score though, the overclock pushes us up, or down depending on how you read it, to 120.87 seconds, a decrease in time to render of 27.1% over stock. Non-hyperthreaded score is now 149.05 seconds, which is 10.1% up on the stock i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled. This 149 second run though is 23.31% down on the overclocked hyperthreaded score, but it is 23.01% up on the run that the non-hyperthreaded i3 550 managed at stock. Single-threaded performance sees a pretty decent drop in time to render, down from 298.85 seconds to 226.98 seconds. This is 24.05% faster than it managed to render the frame at stock, but compared to the overclocked dual-core hyperthreaded score, this is 87.79% slower. We're moving on to 7-zip compression and decompression next, and we're using 7-zip's built-in benchmark to do this. The way we run this benchmark is that we run the benchmark in blocks of 3, with each block consisting of 4 runs of the benchmark. We then take an average score from each of these 3 blocks and average those scores together to get our final score. So compression is first up, and at stock clocks, the i3 550 manages to score 8,978 MIPS, or millions of instructions per second. Switching hyperthreading off sees this drop by 28.7%, down to 6,401.67 MIPS. And running the benchmark single thread only sees this drop by a further 46.3%, down to 3,438 MIPS, which is 61.7% down on the stock i3 550. The overclock though sees a 26.1% increase in score to 11,321 MIPS for the i3 550. With hyperthreading disabled, the overclock boosts the score by 30.28% over stock to 8,340.33 MIPS, which is 7.1% down on the stock clocked 2-core 4-thread version of the i3 550. Single-threaded performance sees an increase of 25.34% with the overclock to 4,309.33 MIPS, which is 48.33% down on the i3 550 with hyperthreading disabled, or 61.94% down on the i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled. The decompression benchmark is next up, and at stock, the i3 550 manages to score 11,118 MIPS. Disabling hyperthreading drops the score down by 22.35% to 8,632.67 MIPS, and single-threaded performance drops by a further 48.5% down to 4,445.67 MIPS, which is 60.01% down on the i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled. The overclock boosts the stock i3 550 score up by 31.86% to 14,660 MIPS. The non-hyperthreaded score sees a boost of 31.75% on stock clocks to 11,373.33 MIPS, which is actually 2.3% up on the stock clocked 2-core 4-thread version of the i3 550, but 22.42% down on the overclocked i3 550. Single-threaded performance sees a boost in score of 32.38% from the overclock to 5,885 MIPS, which is 48.26% down on the non-hyperthreaded score, or 59.86% down on the dual-core hyperthreaded score. And to finish off the tests, we're taking a look at power draw. Now, to measure power draw, we use an actual physical clamp meter around the CPU power cable to get an accurate representation of just how much power the CPU is pulling before losses incurred by the VRM are taken into account. We're measuring the power draw at idle and also the power draw at full load in Cinebench R23. And at stock, the i3 550 pulls 26.08 watts plus or minus 3% down the CPU power cable, which sees an increase of 111.81% over stock clocks to 55.24 watts plus or minus 3% with the overclock. Switching hyperthreading off sees a 27.57% reduction in power draw over stock clocks, down to 18.89 watts plus or minus 3%, although the non-hyperthreaded power draw shoots up by 120.12% over stock to 41.58 watts plus or minus 3%, which is 59.43% more power than the stock i3 550 pulls, despite the overclocked non-hyperthreaded i3 550 only scoring 0.7% more. Single-threaded power draw at stock is 14.68 watts plus or minus 3% down the CPU power cable, which is 43.71% down on the stock i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled, and a 22.29% reduction on the i3 550 with it disabled. The overclock boosts the single-threaded power draw up to 27.64 watts plus or minus 3%, which is 88.28% more power than it draws at stock. This is also 5.98% more than the stock clocked i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled pulls, and this is despite the single thread overclock performance being far worse than even the stock i3 550 with hyperthreading enabled, showing just how inefficient the i3 550 becomes once you overclock it. And lastly is idle power draw, and at stock, the i3 550 only pulls 6.77 watts plus or minus 3%, and this is with all power savings disabled in the BIOS. The overclock though shoots this up by 76.22% over stock to 11.93 watts plus or minus 3%. So to conclude, the i3 550, it performed kind of how you would expect a 10-year-old dual-core CPU to perform. That's not to say it was by any means bad though, because despite the remaining problems with things like microstutter and general frame time inconsistency throughout all of the games we tested today, it is still quite playable throughout all of those games, at least in the parts of the games we tested. I can't say the same for Shadow of the Tomb Raider though, because I'm not entirely sure just how representative of the rest of the game the inbuilt benchmark actually is. But yeah, overall I actually was kind of impressed with how well it managed to hold up in games a lot more modern than the CPU itself. One thing that limited us in the games, though, was the 4.22 gigahertz overclock, because that from what I've seen online, from a few examples I've seen online anyway, the 4.22 gigahertz overclock did seem kind of low compared to what other people have managed. Even us, for example, managed 4.6 gigahertz on a second i3 550 that we had. We didn't use that particular one, though, because due to the memory overclocking issues we mentioned before, that couldn't run memory when overclocked over 1200 megahertz. And I did not want to run 1333 megahertz RAM lower than the actual stock clocks. So I had to settle for the 4.22 gigahertz capable i3 550 that we had. One thing that was quite interesting, though, is the impact on performance that hyperthreading had in the non-gaming benchmarks. Now, in Cinebench, Blender, and 7-zip, both compression and decompression benchmarks, all of those tests showed the i3 550 with hyperthreading disabled and with the 4.22 gigahertz overclock beating the scores that the stock i3 550 was able to manage with hyperthreading enabled. That does come with the caveat, though, that the i3 550 with an overclock and hyperthreading disabled uses about 60% more power than the stock 2-core 4-thread version of the i3 550 does. So if my dog will actually give me quiet to record this, I'd like to give shout-outs to Patron supporters Shadow in the Void, Peter and Mattis Terak for helping to make all of this possible. And you can also support me through Patreon at patreon.com/benchytests, or you could support me through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/benchytests. And remember, Ko-fi has a hyphen between the KO and the FI. But if you would like to become a patron, for as little as $2 per month, you'll gain early access to all of my videos for as long as you remain a patron. And originally I had planned on getting this video out before Christmas, but unfortunately due to the problems I had with the memory overclocking, which took me over a week to figure out, I can't actually get this out before Christmas. So by the time you're watching this, it'll probably be a few days after Christmas. Patrons, though, if I'm lucky and edit this for the rest of the day today, I may actually get it out on Christmas for you guys. So if you are watching this on Christmas Day, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And to the rest of you, I hope you have a Happy New Year, and I really hope 2021 is better for all of us, which I'm sure is a sentiment all of you can agree with. So yeah, thanks for watching the video, and hopefully I'll see you next time.